This case has to be one of the most chilling and calculated I have seen. It is not violent or anything like that, but the method and reasons behind this case definitely puts it up there as one of the most intriguing and disturbing. Peggy and Peggy Carr lived in a small town called Alturas in Florida. The couple lived with 4 of their 5 children in a rather rural area. Their residence was so rural that their only neighbours were George Trepal and his wife Diana. In October of 1988, Peggy was working her job as a waitress at a restaurant when she began to feel a strange and unique kind of pain. Her arms and legs had gone numb and she was experiencing chest pains. Peggy and her daughter worked together at the same restaurant. She told her daughter that she believed she was having a heart attack. They both left work and Sissy drove her mother home. But by the time she had gotten home, the pain had become so overwhelming. Her husband, Pi, drove her to the hospital. Peggy told the doctor that she felt like she was on fire. Her symptoms left doctors confused. Peggy was experiencing burning sensations all over her body. She could not open her eyes and she couldn't speak. And her hair was dropping out at a rapid pace. After 3 days, Peggy's symptoms began to subside, and she seemed to be improving. Doctors became satisfied with her improvements, and she was subsequently sent home. But Peggy's children were now also feeling these strange and mysterious symptoms too. Her son Dwayne and Pi's son Travis had also started to complain about a burning sensation throughout their bodies. And just when Peggy thought she was out of the woods, her symptoms had returned, and a couple of days after she was let out of the hospital, she was rushed back in an ambulance. A neurologist and an infectious disease specialist began to converse about these strange symptoms that Peggy was experiencing. They had a hunch that Peggy's pain was being caused by some kind of poison, and they came to the conclusion that it could be in fact the result of thallium. Thallium is an odourless and tasteless metal, and it is a naturally occurring element found in everyone's body, but only in extremely small traces. People who ingest large amounts of thallium over a short period of time experience horrendous symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss, and it also causes damage to the nervous system, lungs, heart, liver, and kidneys. If enough is ingested, it will be fatal, and the death is slow and painful. It was used as a pesticide to kill everything from cockroaches to rats in the 60s, but it was proved to be too dangerous to be distributed to the public and was banned in 1972. Fearing the worst, these doctors ran tests on Peggy's body and anxiously awaited the results. Like I said, everyone has traces of this element in their body, but Peggy's urine contained 20,000 times more than what is usual. Their sons that were experiencing these symptoms were tested, and they too tested positive for the poison. When doctors then told Pi about the diagnosis, it left him feeling perplexed. He couldn't think of anybody who hated the family enough to poison them. Pi remained somewhat unconvinced of the doctor's diagnosis. Despite his skepticism, the doctors had contacted the police to investigate the matter, as they were certain that this was a deliberate attempt to take the lives of those family members. Just as the police were contacted, Peggy had slipped into a coma. These kinds of cases usually tend to be the victim's partner. When investigators began to look into the family, they quickly learned that the couple's marriage wasn't going too well. In fact, Pi was seeing another woman on the side, and had reportedly taken out large insurance policies on Peggy and their sons. They were fairly convinced that he was the one responsible. But when he was examined by doctors, he too tested positive for the poison, although there wasn't quite enough in his system to cause him serious problems. This made the police believe that someone else was responsible for this crime. Investigators began to test various objects in the house to see if any tested positive for the poison. After testing 400 items, they found what they were looking for. Traces of thallium were discovered in the bottom of some empty Coca-Cola bottles. They also tested some of the unopened bottles that were still full of the beverage, and they found that the bottle caps had been tampered with, and thallium was found in every single one. Any possibility of factory tampering was investigated and ruled out. Investigators then questioned George Trepal, the family's nearest neighbour and the person I mentioned near the start of the video. George's wife Diana had gotten into a heated exchange with Peggy just days before she became ill. The boys of the Carr family had been playing music loudly. This had greatly angered George and Diana. When the investigators began to speak to George about what had happened to Peggy, he seemed unfazed by the events. In fact, he seemed to still harbour anger towards the Poison family and showed no sympathy towards them. One of the detectives asked George why anyone would want to harm the Carr family, and if he knew of any motive. Investigators then discovered that George hated how the Carr family were constantly having people over, and that their dogs were constantly barking, and that they played their music too loud. George then gave the chilling reply to the question about why anyone would want to harm the family. He said, to get them to move. Now this was strange, because the Carr family had actually received an anonymous letter only months earlier. This letter was threatening in nature, and it read, "Move out of Florida forever, or else you all die." Because he had just echoed the letter's writings, he became a suspect in the case. George was a past convict, guilty of manufacturing illegal substances. He also had a very high IQ and was a member of Mensa. Investigators knew that if he was responsible, he would have taken great care in covering his tracks. Now this is a rather strange thing about this case. George and Diana actually set up murder mystery weekends exclusively for Mensa members, and these murder mystery weekends were invitation only. They would set up a make-believe homicide that would need to solve by solving clues over the weekend. George had a keen interest in true crime and saw himself as an expert on the topic. Thankfully, the Carr's children, Dwayne and Travis, managed to get better. But sadly, Peggy never came out of her coma and died in hospital in March of 1983, aged just 41. An undercover detective was brought into the case, a woman named Susan Gorick. Susan went under a new fictitious identity. She played the part of a sheepish woman who was abused by her husband and went by the name Sherry Gwynn. To keep it simple, I'll just keep referring to her as Susan. Susan sent a letter to George asking if she could be accepted into the Mensa murder weekend, and he approved. On the 14th of April, Susan met George for the first time at his event. Investigators hoped that Susan could gain the trust of George, and that maybe he would confide in her and tell her what he had done. But George was intelligent, and he knew better than to tell somebody about the sinister plan he had carried out upon an innocent family. But he did seem to have a fondness for Susan. The two actually even spoke on the phone, and before long, George invited Susan to his house. On the table of George's home was a book, the Agatha Christie novel, The Pale Horse, in which a murderer uses thallium to poison his victims. And other small pieces of evidence began to appear. For instance, when Susan was playing the part of an abused woman, George told her that she should blackmail her husband and mentioned something about poisonous flowers. George then told Susan that he was planning on moving as his wife worked as a doctor and needed to change location. Susan then asked if she would be able to rent their home to get away from her fictitious abusive husband. George agreed to this, and Susan moved in. Immediately, a team of crime scene technicians began their search for evidence, but they found no sign of poison anywhere. Investigators did find a number of secret rooms in George's house. one of which was completely soundproof. When the door was closed, nothing could be heard inside the room. Someone could be screaming at the top of their lungs and you still wouldn't hear a thing. Inside this soundproof room was a wooden bed with restraints for restraining arms and legs. These rooms were searched for blood and other bodily fluids, none of which were found, but it did also appear that the rooms had just been completed. Susan had now been working on this case for over a year, and people around the office became skeptical of her abilities as an investigator, and some of them even believed that she had been seduced by George and that she was now secretly working for him as some kind of double agent. But Susan then came up with a genius but very risky plan. Susan asked if she could meet up with George again and tell him that some investigators had come over and asked where George was, and that they wanted to speak to him about a poisoning. The lead investigators anxiously agreed. In January of 1990, Susan made a call to George and told him she needed to speak to him urgently. George agreed to meet her at a fast food restaurant. In preparation for the meeting, Susan used a secret microphone hidden in her purse, and a nearby surveillance van was parked outside receiving the audio and recording it. Susan then told him the story that some investigators had come looking for him about the poisoning. George seemed a little worried and said to Susanna, "I hope I'm not a prime suspect. That could be messy." But that was it. Nothing else came out of their conversation. It seemed that George could potentially get away with murder. Perhaps he really was just too intelligent. That was until a very late and unexpected call came from the FBI's laboratory. They had found thallium nitrate in some of the items taken from George's house. A team of officers went to George and Diane's home, and they told him he was under arrest for the murder of Peggy. Investigators then searched their new home, and inside this new home, they discovered a new secret room that had also been soundproofed, and the windows had been taken out. What he planned to do in these rooms is unknown, but just the thought of a killer having a secret soundproof room is chilling. On March the 6th, 1991, George Trepal was sentenced to death for taking the life of Peggy Carr, and in the same year, Susan Gorick was named Florida Deputy Sheriff of the Year. The evidence that was used against George was entirely circumstantial. When the FBI tried putting thallium in the Coca-Cola, they found that it noticeably changed the colour, to the point that it would most likely put off someone consuming it. The thallium would also cause the Coca-Cola to fizz up when opened. To avoid the Coke behaving differently, it would have taken someone with a great knowledge and understanding of chemistry. And of course, George had previously gone to jail for creating banned drugs. But Diana had also majored in chemistry during her undergraduate studies. George was not working at the time the crime took place, so he had plenty of time to learn the Carr's routine, and plenty of time to figure out when best to sneak into their home and put the thallium into the Coca-Cola. He also knew how to make thallium, and he had a long list of reasons why he disliked the family. Susan, the undercover investigator, firmly believes he is the one responsible, but to this day, he has never confessed to the crime.